Whether we like it or not, the climate conversation is here to stay. Wherever we look, our livelihoods, our businesses, our environments, they're all affected or impacted by climate. So it's up to us to understand what the next 50 years are going to look like. And if we are not here, leave a better world for the populations that are yet to come and those that are currently working through getting into the system and the ecosystem. So young people come into play. Where do young people fit in the ecosystem? And we have a lot to unpack today. We have a very interesting setup. Nolo Mokoena from Creative Development, Sela Bogonko from Jacob's Ladder Africa, and then we have Chebet Lesan from Bright Green Renewable Energy. So Nolo, we'll start off with you, and I know we'll give our perspective from what we do. Within the next 10, 20, 50 years, we need young people to either be prioritized within this climate conversation or to actually understand what do we mean by green jobs. Did that come out pretty clearly when you visited, or what do we need to rethink? Maybe just talk to us about what your experience was at COP.
What was interesting about this COP was, firstly, the role it played in the general climate conversation. So obviously this is a new topic for a lot of people. It's rising up as a priority, but the reality is this has been a struggle for many, many, many decades. And so what is interesting about this COP in particular, this was a COP that was actually supposed to be us taking stock and asking ourselves, where have we been, where are we going, and more importantly, what needs to happen for us moving forward. The conversation has evolved. I think it's moved from a disaster-lensed conversation into more of an opportunity-lensed conversation. And that's where I think young people need to be playing a role. I always like to say that climate is not particularly just a new sector. I think climate is here to augment sectors. And I think that understanding is vitally important. And I think when you get into the jobs aspect, then obviously as the conversation rolls on, I can unpack that a little bit more. I think the fact that it was hosted by a country that's fundamentally built off natural minerals and resources was quite interesting. I think if we take a justice lens conversation, obviously it's polarizing. But if you're looking to understand minutiae, like you said, what are other countries doing? What have they done? What can Africa do to move forward? I think it becomes a more enriching sort of experience and case study for us to analyze. But long story short, the conversation has finally started moving with momentum from just a disaster, how do we help mitigation sort of conversation, into one of what does adaptation look like and how do we create the kind of vehicles and structures that can kind of generate positive green growth on the continent. Then that's where young people need to be really focused on.
All right, sounds good. So we'll come back to you. Sela, you mentioned you got a lot of value from it. So how do you differentiate then value from talking shop and actually bringing things back to the continent?
COP has become like a marketplace. So you have to know what you're looking for when you go to the marketplace. I think it's because of, they had like 80,000 plus people and multiple, like several thousands of side events, and not just within the COP environment, but just in the greater UAE area. There were many other events that were going on tied to COP. And one of the things that we did prior to getting there was schedule meetings in advance and then get to know who's going to be there. And because everyone who's in climate really, okay, well, not everyone, but most people who are in climate were definitely there. And there were many side events going on. And most of the side events are thematic. So you want to focus on what's going to help you as an individual and how it's going to help your organization, or even just the areas that you want to sort of like grow into and get exposure and get to know, like you said earlier, what exactly are other people doing? What technologies are being adopted by the global north, for example, that are not being implemented here? So how do we as Africans leverage those kinds of technologies? Are those people looking to come into Africa? Are there opportunities to partner? Are there opportunities for job creation? There was a specific focus on green livelihoods this time. There was a whole pavilion that was just set aside for green skills, which was exciting. LinkedIn was there, sort of like showcasing what they have done in terms of the skills, studies that they've done aligned to opportunities in the green space. And there was a lot of conversations even from higher education institutions, in the academia. In the youth pavilion, there was a lot of talk around green jobs. And even in areas like carbon removals, in the CDR area, it's an emerging area, and there's a lot of excitement around it, but there's also the conversation around what it could potentially mean for job creation. We'll come to what that means, because opportunity is different from actual reality on the ground, and translating the opportunities to tangible jobs there's still a lot of work to be done. There's also the issue of climate finance, because with more money coming in, the money is going towards projects. There's an excitement around the loss and damage fund, of course, the 792 million that was committed. It's definitely not what was expected in terms of the actual amount that should have been put aside for loss and damage, but it's something to start with. And many other commitments. And there was also about 8.9 billion that was set aside for green skills and livelihoods. So there's a lot of opportunity, but like I said, opportunity is one thing, and the jobs, tangible jobs, becoming a reality is a totally different story.
Perfect. Yeah. In the past, when we had a climate conversation, it was mostly the last 3-4 years, it was government-led. Yeah. So what governments anticipated was what they wanted the country to go forth with, or maybe private sector that was aligned with government. But then you hear LinkedIn there, you hear universities there. So we have all the players. We have the government, we have the private sector, we have conservationists, all those. In your view, who do you think has mapped out clearly what they're doing within green jobs? We'll get into what green jobs are, but who do you think has taken and moving forward, or what do we need to adjust? Where do we see us moving that in terms of pushing the needle?
We're literally all in the space where we are just realizing that young people need to be part of the conversation. They need to be part of the solutions. They need to be part of the discussion. They're probably the ones going to implement a lot of the ideas that are coming out of conferences like COP. One particular thing I think for me has stood out is looking at, I was particularly interested in seeing LinkedIn there. And I think that when it comes to social media, a lot of these people in the space of social media, through their algorithms and through their math, they're able to see very quickly that it's young people who move the needle. So they probably want to leverage on how do they use, what they've gathered in their particular spaces and bring it into the conversation. I think that's where they think they can be useful. So probably I'd say private sector is moving the fastest when it comes to leveraging the potential of the young people, but not to say that the rest are not following due course. I know that in my particular field, there have been a lot of engagements of particularly young people in terms of funding being put aside to let people know what's happening in the spaces. So I sit on the board of the Clean Cooking Alliance, which is Clean Cooking Alliance, which is it's an outfit that sits in the UN, but with particular focus on energy. And we recently just started to engage young people and try to see how to get young people to, conferences like COP to even just get a feel of what's happening. And I think it's important to have them here so that they realize that sometimes the language used in this kind of conferences can be strange or new to people who do not know about. But in the real sense, we're talking about, hey, the sun is getting hotter because we're destroying, the planet. The rains are getting worse. We're just basically saying that the quality of the life we're living is reducing in big words. Yeah. So everybody experiences that. It doesn't need you to be a professor to know that of late we need to turn our ACs on more often. Everybody's experiencing that. So I think if we can really bring the conversation to that level, then we start to get ideas of what really needs to be done. I personally got an eye-opener last year when I became a mother, and I realized, oh my goodness, I've never thought about what the planet is going to look like in 80 years for my son. And am I doing anything to, you work so hard to make sure they don't get hurt or fall down today, but are you playing the same role in the long term? So I think it's also very eye-opening just being in this stage where you realize it's not just about our generation, it's now about the future generations.
Got you. And we'd like to dispel, because a lot of people, when they think of young people, it's automatically we're doing this for them, or it's a group of people that are vulnerable just waiting for intervention from other people. But it's both people that have come from school, transitioning to new work opportunities, or like people on the table who are doing phenomenal work, scholars, renowned people who just happen to be young. So we'd love for that to come out pretty clearly. We're not doing anyone a favor. It's a very symbiotic relationship. In that same breath, I'd like to hear from Sela and Nolo. We have people already in engineering doing different facets of schoolwork. Maybe someone is an actuarial scientist, an accountant. We're not necessarily telling them to adjust to fit and get into green jobs. We're telling them that we might need to plug in a bit into what they're already doing to see some elements of green jobs in what they do. Just unpack that for us.
I think what's vitally important, George, is one of the key issues why there's been such conflict around defining what a green job is in a substantive manner that kind of brings consensus is because our belief, at least from creative development and our campaign, is actually we believe in the greening of jobs. And when you look at the greening of jobs, now you're talking about a scale. Effectively, what we're saying is current jobs in the market, particularly in anchor markets. So if you're looking at, leading economies, they're built around certain things, whether it's agriculture, mining, sports, financial services for a lot of African states, etc. What we need to understand is in our journey, which is actually a low carbon development pathway, what does the greening of these jobs look like? Because all of a sudden then, you're not having a net zero conversation, not from a climate perspective, I'm talking about from a jobs perspective, where you're saying, if we create these ones, we lose these ones. Now you're asking yourself, how do we create sustainable transitions for entire sectors and only if need be, completely move away from those, but we're not doing so in a way that compromises the livelihoods of entire communities and actually leaves people behind. Because that's another conversation, is that the ambition of the climate revolution in Africa is to create more inclusivity, but the reality is unless we're highly strategic, we do risk leaving a significant amount of people behind. And this is a conversation we need to be having. So for us, our perspective is we need to be talking about the greening of jobs. And what this does is it creates leeway for us to actually go deeper and actually understand maybe greening in this particular sector looks a certain way, and in this particular sector looks a certain way. And we can have sector roadmaps to actually get us to that place.
But just to go back to what Nolo was saying, and maybe I could jump into go back to an example of his country. I think it's in Limpopo where you're shutting down a coal mine, yes, and therefore the power station is actually being shut down. And there are people, a whole community that were reliant on that project. And a lot of the studies that are coming from South Africa are saying that that many people are anti this whole process of green transition because, especially in the energy sector, because it's not just the jobs. It's like people have grown up with the understanding that a project is like a part of their community. So it does affect them more than just the jobs aspect. And so the transition is definitely needful, and the approach from a greening the jobs perspective is needful. I just want to throw in a comment around the issue of, while we are talking about greening the jobs, I actually encourage as many young people as possible, get a course or get familiar, get whatever form of climate literacy you can, because where we're heading as a globe, you will need it. Whether you're in finance or as an architect or even in transport, every sector is being affected, and you will have an advantage if you have some form of green skills, and not just and that's for sectors that are existing. But there are also emerging sectors, for example, in the e-mobility space. In Africa, it's not yet really settled as much as it could, but that's an area. Even your boda guys or Okada, if you're from Nigeria and listening, they'll definitely be affected. So imagine if you can learn some form of skill to maybe be the ones that are offering the spare part business, or the repair of the EVs, because that's a different business compared to the current motorbikes that we use. So every single person needs some form of skills, and that's where private sector comes in to offer the opportunity, like I was saying, either LinkedIn or other forms of academic institutions. Unfortunately, our academia doesn't move as fast as it could. We are speaking about just basics of climate awareness, which is part of what we do as Jacob's Ladder. We create awareness. We start from the basics because we know you have to even know what climate change is before you start getting to CDR, for example, or to carbon markets. You have to start. We have to start somewhere. But the curriculum or change of curriculum is not the way to go. So greening is important, but we have to be. There's a lot of work to be done. There's how the existing sectors need to be greened, but there's also opportunity around emerging sectors that we need to begin to look at, in my view.
Yeah. So here's the reason why it's such a awareness as well. Is a huge part to play. For example, you find someone who maybe didn't study anything in regards to a certain specification or even engineering, whatever, you name it, from school. They've come out and they said, I don't know what to do after school. I want to be an entrepreneur. I want to sell maybe a few clothes online. I want to start a podcast. I want to record stuff and be a content creator. And they end up making bank. They make good money. Yes. How then do you say, okay, that podcast you've been shooting every week? Right. We need it to be inclined to green job. There's no reason, so there's no reason and there's no understanding of it, but we need people to know what's happening, even with some of those that look like mainstream, well lucrative jobs. So I know you want to say something.
I really want to. Go ahead.
I know it's yours. I'm just saying, like really for me, just like 20 seconds on this. I think a lot of the work we've done at Creative Development has actually been about that.
Yeah.
Really first understanding where people are and how they're having conversations. And, this thing you're talking about is one way you should be honest. People are talking about the climate revolution.
Yeah.
People were talking about 4IR in Africa. I'm telling them, we missed the third one.
We missed the
we missed the first one. You talk about 4IR when people are still getting connected to internet for the first time today. And so even when you talk about this, I think the example you gave is so important, because unless we truly understand where the linkages are and how the linkages have to play, which is the greening process, we can never be realistic about how we're tackling this. I just want to say I really agree with that, because young people are saying like a lot of it is really coming up against that.
But hopefully Chebet can also, maybe from your perspective, I'd love to share, because we did a study as Jacob's Ladder on understanding what young people think of climate, so I can share that in a bit. Yeah. But I also want to hear from you on the practical way of making it, getting more young people.
Okay, so first, I think one of the primary things that especially we need to have as a discussion within this context of the African region is we are in such a different space developmentally from like Europe or the US. And they're the ones leading this discussion. And one thing we need to acknowledge is they're pushing the agenda of their current needs. And their current needs are not our current needs. And it trickles down all the way from government level to the person who just finished university. Because what is my need at this particular point? I need to buy food. I need to take care of my family. I'm going to find the most practical way to be able to sort out my immediate needs. How young people see climate right now, it's a luxury. It's a luxury you can afford when you've taken care of, the other basic needs that we have. And when you look at the continent and the level of economic strife that's in this continent, it doesn't make any sense to introduce a discussion of climate in this space. So the question I have been asking myself for the last 2 or 3 years is, where's that sweet spot where it will make sense for everyone? And I think this is a task of entrepreneurs. This is a task of business people. We are the people who come in and say, there's a problem here. You have a problem. You have a problem. How can I create a solution? One of the things I think is the easiest way to communicate to people is, will the skill you have be relevant in the next 10 years? I mean, if you're the person who is, for example, running from point A to B to deliver something on a boda that uses fuel. Right next to you is your competitor with electric bodas. Will you be relevant? I think sometimes you need to speak in their language for them to start to understand, this might be practical now, but will phase out really fast. I think that's the only language you can speak to young people in this sense. So are you aligning yourself to where the world is going? Because if you don't align yourself with where the world is going, economically, you will be at a disadvantage. So I think the conversation needs to move from climate and all these big words to how are you going to be able to put food on your table 10 years from now? You see? Yeah. And then when you start to have the conversation like that, then you start to align with where the world is going, but contextually it makes sense for you. So to answer all the questions about, what young people think, I think that as entrepreneurs, one of the primary things or primary ways we can align ourselves is think about how are we solving problems for the future and not necessarily problems for now. I've been particularly challenged in our business because one of the things when we look at, one of the ways to solve the problems that we face as a continent is what are the opportunities available to us. When we think about Africa, we have sun 12 months a year. Are we taking advantage of that? Or are we waiting for people who have noticed that opportunity to come and take advantage of it for us and then cry foul in the next, 20 years, So are the people who are leading businesses right now, are they thinking about how the manufacturing companies here, have they shifted to solar yet? Are they seeing the opportunity in solar? Of course, the argument and the case you need to take to them is solar is cheaper than what you're using currently, there's different kinds of electricity you can use to produce. Those are all arguments that could be used. But at the same time, the relevance of it and the opportunity for young people to take advantage of that particular scenario now. So is the business that you're starting now, you might be selling clothes and that's great, but 10 years from now, is there somebody who can think of a way to sell clothes in a greener way that will be, and will get funding for this kind of, will be aligned with the money that's funding green projects, and will take you out of business in an afternoon. Yeah, so I think that's really where we need to get young people thinking about climate, and that's where we need to get people thinking about not now. Like, let's think about 10, 20 years from now and start now. Yeah.
There's a
I was about to say, I'm so sorry. I think this part we're discussing is actually vitally important, because I think this is actually where the rubber hits the road. Everything you've mentioned is critically important, and the reason it is because whether we like it or not, the structural issues that inhibit young people getting absorbed into the ecosystem will not be solved by climate alone. I think climate is a catalyst, but climate alone is not the answer. Let's backtrack a few years. COVID-19, global pandemic happens. In Africa, what was exposed was always exposed. We've always known our healthcare system doesn't have capacity. All that COVID-19 did was exacerbate the visibility. It didn't even exacerbate the lack of capacity. It exacerbated the visibility on us recognizing that our healthcare infrastructure actually cannot maintain the needs. And so I think what you've mentioned is so important, whether it's fashion, whether it's automotive industry, whether it's power, climate is a catalyst. And I think when we approach it as a catalyst, we then all of a sudden can really tap into the potential of what this could mean. In some economies, it might be a complete shift. For other economies, it'll be an accelerator forward in the current industrial trajectory they have, an economic growth trajectory they have. For some economies, it'll be a catalyst for greater equity. For some economies, it'll actually strengthen democracy and provide a platform to build on. But the reality is the structural issues we have are the true inhibitors to young people being absorbed into the main economic system. And the key question is, how do we use this moment right now as a potential catalyst to solve some of that so we can create momentum? We might not know precisely what 20 years looks like from now, but I think we can have a decently good idea of what's not going to change.
We're super keen on the kind of people that speak directly to the young people that can feel a concert and embed a messaging in the concert. Your artists, your movie stars, your celebrities, your influencers also on social media who do massive awareness campaigns, malaria, blah, you name it, anything that has a social connotation to it, someone has spoken about it online. What has been your experience? When I hear creative development, I think about developing messaging creatively. Yes. But what's been your experience, either working with the artists or having them speak about your messaging? What's been your experience?
Our work is actually around this. Our organization was really founded around really what we call the 3C model. And so how do we work more creatively and closely with the community of creatives, actual communities on the ground, so that development is actually community-led as opposed to us parachuting in. And then the third piece is really champions. And our whole thesis around the champions is, how do we find the unconventional voices in development, philanthropy, and government who might not be seen as champions but are actually doing and advocating in a serious way? And that authenticity is important if these three are going to work well together. Last year we launched our campaign. It was called We Are. It's actually called We Are Unmuted. And in just over 14 months, we managed to reach over 120 million young people. We managed to capacitate over 4,000 young leaders in 6 different countries using this model, working with creative hubs on the ground. What were some of the key insights? Number one, which I think we've all been saying the same thing, this thing is too complicated.
Yeah.
And one of the issues we have is, those of us sitting around the table here, we went to school, master's, PhD, postdoc, second master's. So people don't like admitting that I don't know.
Yeah.
Number two, our ethos is really built on who we are. And so for creative development, it's not about recreating wheels that don't need to be recreated. And one thing we've seen is, if you look at history, art has always sat right next to significant change moments in Africa. You think of Sankara, Fela Kuti's right next to him. Nelson Mandela, Hugh Masekela, and Miriam Makeba. It's almost as if for things to really grab a hold, we need to have somewhat of a rhythm to it. So it's not just about that, but it's actually about understanding the role creatives play in African society. Historically, creatives have always been the voice that's true, that's honest, and more importantly, doesn't just represent people, but also speaks truth to power. This is where the creative community is vitally important. Now, we are not advocates on celebrities. Some of our champions happen to be celebrities. We're looking for authentic artists, which truly represent communities in a meaningful and authentic way, so that communities trust the messaging and are engaging from an open posture where there's equality, there's representation, and we're not leveraging them. So that's the second thing we've seen, which is why this community is vitally important in engaging. And I will say the third thing, actually, I'm lying. The third thing is our big focus is, at least for me in my function as the CIO, I'm the Chief Innovation Officer of our business, is like always thinking about what does a post-2030 world look like? SDGs are the unifying vision for the world till 2030. What happens in 2031? Who's setting that agenda? What are the priorities? What do they mean to us? And we found in our work that creatives are far better at imagining the ideal future than us who have studied and can quote policies and know the numbers, GDP growth rates, who's doing what. I think that piece is also vitally important.
I want to jump in just quickly because I have an example of what Nolo's sharing. So the reason we blew up about 6 years ago was because we used artists to go into the community to sell our product. And it was very interesting because the people we thought would be most impactful weren't, whereas particularly interesting characters that had homegrown characters within the community were the most trusted and the most listened to by the community about the change that was being introduced here. We were working at that time with different markets around, a certain section of Nairobi. And we did all this, road shows and what have you, and they were talking about the product. One of the things that came out very clearly is if you want to change a community's mind, you need to speak to their hearts. Because people make decisions with their hearts. So unless there's trust involved in the messaging that is being given to them, then you're not making much progress. And we have this, we have very interesting context in Africa. People will be accommodating of you, but you're not necessarily changing their minds. The onus is really on you as a business person or as a policy person to think about whether you actually get into the heart of whoever it is you're trying to reach and whether you're changing how they think, because that's where the change is going to start. So for me, I think artists and climate change is a really good alignment that we need to think about if we're going to reach the hearts of the people, especially the young people in Africa.
So I'd love to hear from you, especially because of the distinction between all these people we're talking about and activists. There's a line in between. Yeah.
So from our work, we found that when an activist or when activists stand to speak, they speak to a certain audience. They really have an urgency they try to create an urgency to the issue, and therefore they appeal to a certain sort of like audience. And for the most part, sometimes they lose a certain portion, especially when it comes to young people. They'll just know that this person is an activist, they're trying to get us to know this, but they won't go into the details of what the issue is. So they'll probably just know that they're addressing the issue of climate change, but not necessarily know why exactly it's a big issue for them. And in this age of social media, we know that while we have, they're both saying, I couldn't even agree more, there are certain people who are already established, sort of like creatives, and are in that space around content generation or content creation. When we're living in a space where content creation is almost like everyone can create content. You just have to give them the recipe or whatever it is that they need to be able to generate that content. We were talking earlier about TikTok and the reason why it's blown up so much. And it's just because you create a challenge and people pick it up, regardless of the age. But sometimes and most times it comes from a musician, an artist who just does a very short piece and then it goes viral. So how do we get to the point where climate change is demystified enough to be broken down to that young person who in another world would not care about climate change? So it has to be demystified, and then it has to be able to, like what Chebet is saying, resonate with the people. And part of the work that we have begun doing and are going into next year, which I was sharing about earlier, is around using the creatives to be able to not necessarily using established creatives, but raising the next generation of creatives who, while they're learning the skill and the art, they're also learning the value, the essence of climate change. And so they're learning the content of climate change in order to be able to create content that would then be able to communicate to their audiences. And like we know, they influence far much larger number of people compared to even politicians, so you want to be able to leverage them as culture shaping icons, because they're the ones that are going to determine, like you're saying, the next 20, 30 years. They're the ones shaping the ideas. And for us to galvanize, especially from an African context, for us to galvanize people, we definitely need to be able to leverage the creative economy, because they've been left out for the most part, and they are an essential piece of this story that is being told.
And then we seem to be catching up. So, actually, that person could speak on that particular topic, but at that time, you've already executed your marketing budget and you don't know how to pull it back. So let's talk about you, Chebet. We'll touch on what's happening in Kenya, and then maybe the question we had posed earlier. I know certain policies can go a long way in enabling the business for the next 5, 10, however many decades we want. What would that policy shift or pivoting of policy, or what does that look like in your space that could help further your business?
I think one of the most important things for any business is the environment in which it operates. You could have an excellent business model, but the environment just doesn't work for you. One of the things that I identified very quickly when I was young and I didn't know how important policy is was that the space I got into was very punitive for us. Why? Because we were competing against firewood and charcoal, which were untaxed, or informal businesses typically are very difficult to, formalize. So, and also in terms of taxation and what have you. So here we are, young business, all our legal structures in place, which automatically meant that we would be vatable and other things. And the VAT on our product made us uncompetitive. It made it very difficult for us to compete with the other products in the market of the nature that we were serving. We needed policies to support us. So one of the things we were looking for very early on, and these things take time, was could we get briquettes, which is what we call them here, could we get briquettes in Kenya VAT exempt?
I just want to add on that point in relation to an example that kept coming up in COP28 around what the US has done that has had a ripple effect across the globe, actually. The Inflation Reduction Act, which has literally sucked the money back to the US in terms of innovation for green solutions. Talk about, like I said, direct air capture, carbon removals, energy, renewable energy solutions. And that's the kind of example that you'd want to see, especially in Africa, because we have the largest deposits when it comes to critical minerals. In terms of even the youthful population, we have a lot going for us in terms of renewable energy. 40% of the world's renewable energy potential is in Africa. So we have to be able to change our game at the COP level and then be able to have examples, tangible examples of policies that are working in different countries, whether it's in the carbon market space or in the clean cooking, because there are many people that don't have access to clean cooking. Still, 700 million Africans don't have access to clean cooking. So one of the things that we've been working on is a Green Jobs Index as Jacob's Ladder. And we realized that if we have a way of measuring ourselves in terms of the rate at which, when I say we, I mean all the countries, if you're
African countries.
No, all the countries, like globally. If we can be able to have like the ease of doing business index, there's a way that it would push us. Every time our former president, for example, would stand and say, we have moved from number this to number this. And then we know Africans, how, especially Kenyans, the performance has to be, a certain way. So imagine having an index that allows you to be able to move from this level to this level. And then the indicators that would help you move. Increase your renewable energy percentage in the grid. Increase climate literacy, for example. Remove certain, or give tax rebates for certain sectors that will generate or create jobs ultimately. So that's an exciting project which we definitely will be announcing very soon, and we hope that it will help countries to develop policies that will help them create jobs.
Put yourself in a scenario where, so the next COP it's too premature to expect some certain targets. 2030, you're seated in a room, 2030, finish the sentence. Within the green jobs space, I was able to
create jobs. I'm squarely right at the center of it.
Yeah.
I'm a job creator.
Are you going to quantify?
It's on record. Policy and governance. I think we're looking at not less than 5,000 jobs. And this is direct jobs. So within indirect, probably in the tens of thousands.
Right. And that's not far, actually. That's just 6 years down the line. Yeah. Alrighty. By 2030, I was able to
catalyze 7 million jobs in Africa. Our vision as Jacob's Ladder is to catalyze 10 million jobs by 2033. So I'm just sort of like, appropriating that.
Yeah.
And I think it's possible. And looking at the investments that are coming in, make decisions that are beneficial to our people. And then at the private sector level, encourage as many of them as possible to come and invest. And then I love the last point about repatriating value chains. Yeah. We're the ones that have with the EV sector sort of like birding in other countries, we're the ones that are supplying the critical minerals. Why aren't we assembling, for example, solar panels here? Why aren't the batteries being, manufactured here? So those are questions that we need to ask ourselves and then begin to not just talk about it, but actually begin to demand that those factories that are out there come and do it here on the continent.
It's interesting that we're starting to extract the word skills gap towards the tail end of the conversation. But maybe before I ask you that question, are there any other skills you see young people should start looking into that would be beneficial down the line, 5-10 years?
I think Africa needs to start thinking about itself as a global producer. Don't just think about making a product to sell to the person next to you. How can you export that product? I think we need to start pricing our products in dollars and not in our local currencies. Yeah, so for sure, that's what I think that everybody needs to think about. If I'm producing this cup, how do I get to the other corner of the world? What value do they need there? And how can I produce it here and take it there? Because that way, then we begin to reset whether we are importers of foreign capital or exporters.
I would say one of the things that we should always remember is that 40% of the world's young population will be residing in Africa by 2050. We have an amazing potential when it comes to creation of jobs, but we also have a possibly huge challenge coming our way. And so I think that countries need to zero in on how best to create jobs, not just, and I believe this firmly, not just within the continent, but how do we begin to create jobs that are required in other parts of the country? Because while Africa's population is getting younger, the other globe, especially in the global north, it's getting older. So how do we begin to leverage our young people as a resource that will help us be able to advance, whether it's in the innovation space? Because we could actually increase in number, we're just increasing our burden if we're not able to close those skills gap. Earlier this year, there was a huge project that was broken in Kenya, the broke ground in Kenya in green hydrogen. And the amazing thing is that there are no green hydrogen engineers in Kenya. So you see, we have sometimes when you speak about jobs, the jobs opportunities might come, but unless we address the bridge between academia and industry, we're also sort of like not really moving forward. So there has to be aggressive focus to sort of like narrow down the demand that will be required and then the skill sets that's coming out of our education institutions.
Nolo, 2030, you seated in a room, you say
we would have created 1 million green jobs through adaptation impacting or related initiatives. And that's our specific focus. It's not just around throwing a big number. Adaptation is important because that's where you highlight the opportunity. Mitigation is more around how do we have measures to protect, but adaptation is talking about transforming societies, communities, sectors, cities, and spaces. And that's our very clear focus. We don't just want to create 1 million green jobs by 2030. We want to say these jobs were created through adaptation measures in Africa to help African countries prepare for an imminent future of climate vulnerability, unpredictability, and the sort of, unpredictable realities that are coming their way. So that's our very clear, specific focus. The partners are very clear, the players are very clear, finances are very clear, and we're very excited about the potential of having that specific goal as we move forward.
Right. So let's put a pin on it. I know we can't unpack everything, but I really do appreciate your time and your insight. We were just discussing a barrage of conversations just stemming from COP28 and what happens after. We have the tendency of reaching a huge summit preparation before, and then whatever happens after loses momentum or it gets lost in all this big picture with everything that we're working towards within private sector, public sector in our different countries. But the conversation remains. A lot of the young people still lack some bit of understanding. Some have moved a bit forward with the conversation on green jobs, but we're just trying to unpack where the opportunities are. Our panelists have spoken about their respective industries and given perspective on some of the linkages that we can see even towards industry, on ground, you name it. So just play this back as many times as you'd like. There are a lot of gems in there. Nolo, Sela, Chebet, George Indirango, thank you very much for your time. We really do appreciate it. Thank you very much.